Hi everybody, and welcome to week 5. This week we're going to be looking at some more of the ideas that Dina Feidelson proposed for various stages of learning how to read. And I begin with this particular quote because it summarizes so much of the issues and difficulties that teachers run into. As you saw last week, there's a lot of disagreement in terms of basic things like the order in which letters and vowels ought to be introduced and how reading should be drilled, how those patterns should be taught. And this debate has been going on, by the way, for centuries, with varying answers in varying communities. For our purposes, because we live in the modern world, and we put a lot of trust in scientific discovery, it's my belief that we ought to be following what the research tells us, even when there are disagreements among the researchers. We need to pick a side and stand by our decisions. Dina Feidelson's masterwork was a book she wrote and published in 1988 known as Facts and Fads in Beginning Reading. She conducted the research for this book while she was on sabbatical from the University of Haifa and was a visiting scholar at both Harvard and NYU. And in both of those locations, she made great use of their phenomenal libraries to do the research, both on how reading was taught throughout the ages, to trace the historical development. Much of what we covered in week 1 was a result of the work that she and other scholars have done, and also particularly to trace the differences between how English reading has been taught in America and England versus how German has been taught in Germany. And this makes a lot of sense because Feidelson was actually born in Vienna and her first language was German. She learned to read in German while she was a child in Vienna, subsequently moving to Israel and doing so much of her incredible work there. In all, the book sets out a 3-phase plan for native language literacy instruction. Of course, this plan will need to be adapted for second language reading, but it's important, I think, that you understand her view of how the reading phases ought to work for first language reading, and then at the end we'll look at second language. Feidelson set out a 3-phase model for how first language reading instruction should be conducted. The first phase, which she called pre-reading, takes place before the onset of formal reading instruction, and it has certain features that are really predominant. It is content-oriented. It has nothing to do with the mechanics of reading. It's all about content. It's completely unstructured. It's whatever the parent and child or teacher and child are interested in pursuing. And it's really very much child-centered, so the focus is on what the child is interested in. It's designed to reach meaning through text. So the adult reads the text to the child. That's the major feature of this. And Feidelson noted that it was really important to have this as a formal part of reading instruction or pre-reading instruction for children who grew up in lower socioeconomic settings or places that were culturally designed not to focus so much on literacy. In middle-class established homes, parents generally read to their children, but this doesn't happen in lower income and socioeconomic depressed areas. Partly because there are not libraries, there's not a great access to free reading material, And the adults in the household rarely read for leisure. They rarely have enough leisure time to actually engage in reading. And so they don't model it for their children. And there are huge statistical differences in terms of how many books are found in different homes at different economic levels, and in terms of how often adults read to children in those settings. So in order to even the playing field, Feidelson felt that in the earliest phases of preschool, that the children should have teachers read to them and read to them a lot. And there has been a significant amount of research that supports this, both in American English settings like Head Start, but also in Israel, where they have found that they really do pretty well even the playing field by providing this kind of rich, language-rich environment in preschools. The second phase rather, is formal reading instruction. This is where students learn to decode. It's radically different from either phase 1 or phase 3 because it is tightly structured. As you saw last week, to create a primer that incorporates all of the findings of research, that requires a very tight structure for the instructional sequences, but the drills also have to be very tightly structured. And the more tightly structured the reading drills are, the better students are at mastering decoding. And by tightly structured, I mean focusing on drilling each vowel with individual vowels with every consonant. So it's designed to systematically build reading proficiency, decoding proficiency. That's really different from what is experienced in phase 1. And phase 3 is known as free unending reading development. This is the phase that takes place after decoding instruction. It's content-oriented, it's unstructured, it's designed to reach meaning through text. All of those items it shares with the first phase. The big difference between phase 1 and phase 3 is that in phase 1, the adults read to children, and in phase 3, the children are reading independently. This week, we're going to focus on pre-reading, that instruction that takes place before the formal onset of decoding instruction. As I mentioned, the hallmark of this phase is that children are read to. That's something that happens in the home, in first language reading, and it's also something that can happen in the school. The emphasis of this reading practice and all of the other activities around pre-reading is an emphasis on enriching the children's knowledge of first language vocabulary and the literary language and language of formal schooling. You'll know that the kind of language used in children's books, things that we read to kids, is quite different from the language that children use informally with each other or with the adults in their lives. And that's done by design. This is a way of preparing students at the very outset of their learning journey, preparing them for the kind of language that they will encounter in school, and especially in the reading work that they'll be doing in school. Now, in America and most other countries, there is accompanying this phase is a set of reading readiness activities. Feidelson really did not like these. She felt that they were counterproductive and should not be incorporated into phase 1. This is controversial. There are researchers that side with Feidelson, and she supported those studies, but there are other studies that point out that the emphasis on these particular skills can actually help prepare children who might otherwise have deficits when they start first grade. And that is the whole purpose for reading readiness. Reading readiness is a term that came into use in the 1920s, and it was mostly a term that was used to refer to a series of tests that were used to measure factors of success in reading acquisition. There were whole batteries of tests that were designed in the early part of the 20th century to determine if youngsters were actually ready to be able to start learning how to read. And typically, if children were not found to be ready, reading instruction for them was delayed. That created a whole series of problems because as class sizes grew, it was really difficult to manage multiple levels within the same classroom. So rather than delay reading for half of first grade and start it with the other half, educators decided that maybe they could create a set of activities that would assist children in learning the prerequisite skills that are necessary for reading acquisition. These skills include visual and auditory discrimination. That means the ability to tell the difference between a bet and a cough, or the sound of s and z. Also, directionality, being able to follow a line of print from right to left or left to right. Letter recognition, being able to identify what the letter is. Phonological awareness, which is the ability to understand that the letter represents a sound within the word and that that same sound can be replicated in different words. The ability to segment speech into individual words and words into syllables and syllables into their component sound symbol relationships. All of these are separate skills. All of them are necessary for reading. And the idea behind reading readiness, especially in kindergarten and now also in preschool, is to make sure that children acquire these skills so that reading acquisition will be easier. Some of the requisite skills that are taught in reading readiness are knowledge of the letter names. This is really controversial because the names of the letters do not map onto the sounds that the letters represent. For example, in English, the letter C is only sometimes S. Other times, more often I believe in English, it's K. The letter W doesn't start D, it's W. So the letter names do not map well onto their sounds. Hebrew is better. Bet is B, Dalet is D, but there are exceptions in Hebrew as well. Yud is not always Ya. Vav is not always V. Bet can be ba or va, depending on whether it has a dot. There is a tendency in diaspora communities to teach that bet and vet are two separate letters, but that's just not the case. They are one letter that makes two sounds. So it's not 100% in Hebrew, even though it's better than English. And for this reason, there are a number of researchers that recommend not teaching the letter name, but rather only teaching the letter sound initially. This is done in Israeli preschools. There was a whole series of products that were created to teach children the sounds of the letters, and they included puppets and manipulatives and all sorts of posters and stories, and the child was told a story in which the sound that the letter represented was a key part of the story. So, for example, with the letter Shin, the story was all about a train that went shh, 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 right? The letter names are often included. This is the flip side of the argument. The letter names are included just so that it makes it easier to identify what letter we're talking about. It's really cumbersome to say to a student, look at the third letter from the right on the fourth word. That's a really long way around saying, take a look at the Dalet. And that same issue exists with the names of vowels. What you'll find is that most pre-primers for Hebrew in America contain the letter names, but not the names of the vowels, even though the vowel sounds within the names of the vowels often map really directly onto the vowel sounds themselves. A major element in reading readiness, especially for Hebrew, is visual discrimination. In English reading, phonological awareness has been shown to be the most important predictor of success and the most important skill that can be taught. Phonological awareness is also important in Hebrew reading, but not as much as it is in English reading, and the most significant predictor of Hebrew reading success is visual memory, and especially visual memory as it relates to visual discrimination. This is, of course, because, as we've noted before, there are just so darn many letters that look so similar. And if you don't have good visual discrimination skills and you don't have a good visual memory, it's going to be darn hard to learn what they make, what sound they make, and how to read altogether. So for visual discrimination, one thing that the research has found to be absolutely true is that you have to focus on the letter shapes. General visual discrimination, like being able to tell the difference between a square and a rectangle, or a circle and a square, or a circle and an oval, that's not a good predictor of reading visual discrimination, because letter shapes are processed differently within the brain than geometric shapes. We saw that way back in week 1 when we were looking at how reading is actually processed. So one of the classic visual discrimination activities is the use of sandpaper letters, which allows students not only to see the letter shape, but to feel the way it works with their fingertips, and to be able to distinguish between a yud and a vav because of length, or a vav and a final nun, or a gimel and a nun based on being able to feel the letter shape. Similarly, there are Hebrew letter manipulatives. These are really useful. These are three-dimensional hard letters, plastic letters. There's also foam letters we saw in a picture earlier. And another good kind of manipulative is pipe cleaners, which can be bent into the shapes of Hebrew letters. Letters can also be made out of clay or Play-Doh, and there are kits actually on the market for you to cut the letters out of Play-Doh, or you can do them freehand. And frankly, I think freehand is probably a better activity for kids because it involves them much more directly in producing the letter shape. In addition to the actual manipulatives that you can buy, or making things out of clay or pipe cleaners, there are also molds on the market that are available that you can use to make either chocolate or plaster of Paris Hebrew letters. The plaster of Paris ones are kind of nice because you keep them forever. The chocolate ones, I think, are more appealing to kids overall because you can eat them. And the manufacturer does recommend that you not use the same mold for both chocolate and plaster. I get that. So if you're going to use both types of materials, get 2 sets of molds. I am particularly fond of edible letters, partly because I think that there is a certain kind of sweetness and reward that when you've mastered the sound that the letter makes or the letter's name, and you then get to consume that, it becomes part of you in a very special kind of way. It also harkens back to an old tradition. It's actually mentioned in the Middle Ages in the Machzor Vitri, a European classic Ashkenazi tradition that on the first day of school, a child was put through a very special ceremony that included the teacher giving the child a slate and writing the letters of the alphabet on the slate in chalk, and then putting honey over each of the letters. And as the child recited each letter, he was allowed to lick the honey off the slate so that he would always associate learning Hebrew and learning Judaism with a sense of sweetness. That's a really great tradition, but I frankly don't want to be licking honey off of a chalkboard. It's much better, I think, to actually have a sugar cookie or a piece of chocolate that serves the same purpose. And I always began the first day of Hebrew school when I was Hebrew school director by distributing Aleph Bet sugar cookies to every student in the school in the hopes that they would always find Hebrew learning to be sweet. Of all the reading readiness activities that promote understanding of the alphabet, tactile letters are good. They're good for using the sense of touch to recognize the shapes. The edible ones are great because they are not only visual, but they also taste good. But there are also real values to kinesthetic activities. In fact, kinesthetic activities are probably the most important of all of them, and the most important of these is actually writing letters and words. It's been noted that tracing the letters that are already printed out, that's a decent activity, but writing them freehand is actually better because it forces that hand-eye coordination that opens up pathways to learning that are really, really important neurologically and really facilitate reading acquisition much better than just tracing. So it's okay to start off with tracing a few shapes, but freehand writing is actually the preferred method, and there's actual research to back that up. Some students really thrive on kinesthetic learning, and so to kind of mix things up a little bit, it's always good to be able to make letter shapes with one's own body. There's actually a book called Aleph Bet Yoga, and there's an edition for kids as well. And you can use the positions recommended by the book, or you can create your own. This kind of activity is especially good for brain breaks, which learners need. It gets them up and moving is really important because that gets the blood flowing, which carries glucose and oxygen to the brain, and that increases a student's ability to learn. So Aleph Bet Yoga is really useful. It's like I said, it's especially good as an activity to kind of break things up when the students are sick of sitting still. Directionality is another skill that students often need to be taught specifically. English is fairly straightforward. It's read from left to right, and it follows a completely linear progression. The I doesn't vary up and down as one reads in English. Unvocalized Hebrew is also linear, but unlike English, it's read from right to left. Students absolutely need some guidance and reinforcement and instruction about the right direction in which to read Hebrew. Vocalized Hebrew, which of course is what students are taught first, is actually a much more complicated directional pattern, because in addition from going from right to left, the eye has to make a zigzag up and down, up and down, up and down in order to find all the vowels and diacritical marks that facilitate proper reading. This is a really complicated eye pattern, and it's something that can be taught specifically, and students can be given activities in tracing the eye movement that they'll need to do. Some directionality training that's used in English reading readiness are mazes and crossword puzzles. Mazes in particular are used to train directionality, and in English, mazes always begin in the upper left-hand corner and progress to the bottom right. The same thing applies to crossword puzzles. They always in English begin on the left side in the upper part and move down toward the right. In Hebrew, the exact opposite has to apply. Mazes in Hebrew need to begin in the upper right-hand corner and progress to the bottom left, and the crossword puzzles in Hebrew need to start in the upper right-hand corner and also progress down to the bottom left. Of all the reading readiness activities that are useful, writing is really the key, because writing serves as a bridge between reading acquisition and encouraging students to build words for themselves. These activities are writing for the sake of reading. That's what reading readiness uses writing for. It's to reinforce what they're learning to do as they read. This week, we're also going to explore writing as a separate and distinct language activity that has value all on its own as well. As I mentioned at the beginning, the activities for Phase 1 are going to need to be adapted for second language reading instruction. This is because obviously in first language reading instruction, the kids already know the language. So it's a matter of enriching their command of the language. That applies here too, but they know much less of the Hebrew language because it's their second language. They're only just starting to learn it. And so it's really important in this phase to emphasize oral Hebrew language work. Oral Hebrew can be taught using pictures and gestures to illustrate the meanings of words, especially nouns, and acting out or pantomime to help them learn verbs. There are a number of second language teaching methods that cover this specific kind of activity. At the same time, key words can be used to introduce the letters. Now, we're not focusing on anything about decoding except the initial letter of each word. So, bet is for bayit. I will recommend that you select those words with special care. You don't want to do something frivolous like bet is for ballon, which is a cognate. You certainly don't want to just use bet to stand for an English word like ball. That's a wasted opportunity. That's not something that's going to facilitate oral language learning. And there are great words for every letter of the alphabet. A colleague of mine decided to find an animal for each letter of the alphabet, which she did. Tzadi is tzipur, although her favorite word was tzfardeya, so that's what she used. Kaf was kelev, and chet was chatul, and dalet was dog, obviously, and aleph was aryeh, and so on and so forth. She had a Hebrew animal name for every single letter of the alphabet. And the kids loved it because they were animal lovers. So why not find the things that the students love and use their passions as a way of introducing them to Hebrew. That's the beauty of this kind of pre-reading phase. It's unstructured. You can go in any direction with it. The key here is to make it fun and to keep it varied. Make it fun because that will entice them to want to learn it. The more fun that it is, the more motivated your students will be to learn. And keeping it varied is also really important because those variations that you do will make it so that they don't quite know what to expect on any given day, and that will heighten their anticipation for what's to come. So enjoy this week, and you'll find a lot of really interesting material about writing in a special website that was set up by the University of Texas for teaching various aspects of second language. And this week we're going to look at the first couple of sections on the part of their website dedicated to teaching second language writing. I will say I did not include the sections of their website that are dedicated to teaching reading, mostly because I really fundamentally disagree with the professor who conducted that particular set of activities and lectures. I really disagree with her approach to teaching reading, and so rather than include it as a part of the course, I leave it to you if you wish to explore it.